May 15, 1948, 5:47 a.m. An Egyptian bomber drops its payload over Tel Aviv. The bomb hits a bus station. Civilians scatter. Bodies hit the pavement. Smoke rises over a city that is less than 18 hours old. The State of Israel had been born at midnight. By dawn, it was already burning. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next video. Join us as we explore more stories, historical events, and inspiring moments from the past. Be part of this community. Every story we tell is a story worth knowing. Here is the number that will define everything you are about to hear. 11 minutes. That is how long it took Harry S. Truman, a haberdasher from Missouri, a man whose own cabinet thought he was making the worst foreign policy mistake of the 20th century, to recognize the State of Israel and change the map of the world forever. 11 minutes. The stroke of a pen. And then the bombs started falling. But this is not just the story of a president and a pen. This is the story of what happened after the pen. What happened when 5 Arab armies crossed 5 borders simultaneously, and the state that Truman had recognized was on the verge of being wiped from the map before it could hold its first election. This is the story of back channels and broken embargoes of a flight engineer who risked federal prison to fly fighter planes across the Atlantic of a ceasefire that was secretly a rearmament operation, and of a man in the White House who found a way to help without officially helping, because officially helping was impossible. By the end of this story, you will understand how a country that the CIA assessed would lose, that the Joint Chiefs assessed would lose, that the entire professional military and diplomatic establishment of the United States assessed would be destroyed within weeks, somehow turned the tide. Somehow survived. Somehow won. But in the first week of May 1948, none of that was visible yet. What was visible was the smoke over Tel Aviv. To understand what Truman was looking at when he sat down with his morning intelligence reports in those first days, you have to understand the military reality on the ground, and it was worse than almost anyone in the American public knew at the time. Israel's military force in May 1948, transitioning rapidly from the Haganah into what would become the Israel Defense Forces, had roughly 30,000 fighters on paper. In practice, the number of trained, equipped, combat-ready soldiers was considerably smaller. They had rifles. They had some light machine guns. They had almost no artillery worth speaking of. What they had was largely improvised, cannibalized from surplus and desperation. They had no tanks. Their air force consisted of a handful of light civilian aircraft that had been hastily modified to drop homemade bombs, machines that would not have been recognized as a military air force by any conventional definition of the term. Against this, the Arab coalition brought regular armies with real equipment. Egypt had aircraft artillery and armored vehicles. The Arab Legion of Transjordan was arguably the best-trained Arab military force in the entire region, commanded by British officers equipped with British weapons, operating on British tactical doctrine. Syria had tanks. Iraq sent forces across the Jordan River. Lebanon pressed from the northwest. 5 armies, 5 directions, simultaneously. The CIA had assessed before the Declaration of Independence that Arab forces would likely prevail in any conventional military conflict. The Joint Chiefs of Staff agreed. The State Department had used this assessment as one of its primary arguments against recognition. Why extend diplomatic recognition to a state that was probably going to be destroyed within weeks? What did America gain by backing a losing side? Truman had recognized Israel anyway, and now the losing side was fighting for its life. The Egyptian advance in the south was moving faster than Israeli defenders could reposition. Egyptian aircraft bombed Tel Aviv on the very first day. That bus station, those civilians, that smoke rising over a city less than a day old. In the east, the Arab Legion crossed the Jordan River and moved on Jerusalem. The Jewish quarter of the Old City, one of the most ancient Jewish communities in the world, was under siege. Food was running out. Defenders were outnumbered and running low on ammunition. The Arab Legion was methodical, professional, and it was tightening its grip day by day. In the north, Syrian forces crossed the border and attacked Jewish settlements in the Galilee settlements, where the defenders were often kibbutz members, farmers who had been handed rifles and told to hold their ground against regular army units with artillery support. Washington was watching. And Washington was not optimistic. The man inside Truman's circle who understood the stakes more clearly than anyone who felt them more personally, who argued about them more passionately, was not a general and not a diplomat. He was a 31-year-old lawyer from St. Louis named Clark Clifford. Clifford was Truman's special counsel, tall and polished, a man who had risen quickly in the White House because he understood not just the law, but the politics, the way decisions landed publicly, the way history would judge them, and the way those two things were rarely as separate as the professionals liked to pretend. Clifford believed in Israel. He believed in it strategically, and he believed in it morally, and he was not shy about making both arguments to anyone who would listen. He was the internal counterweight to the State Department's cold realism. Where Secretary of State George Marshall saw oil fields and Soviet positioning and Arab alliance structures, Clifford saw a moment in history that would define what America stood for and who America was willing to stand with when it cost something. The confrontation came to a head in the Oval Office on May 12, 1948, 2 days before the Declaration. It is one of the most extraordinary meetings in the history of American foreign policy, and it happened almost entirely out of public view. Marshall came in with his case fully prepared. He laid out the strategic argument against recognition with the methodical clarity of the military planner he had been his entire career. The Arab states controlled the oil. The Arab states controlled critical geography. Recognizing Israel would hand the Soviets a gift by positioning America as the enemy of Arab nationalism at exactly the moment when Arab nationalism was becoming a powerful force. The professional recommendation of the State Department: withhold recognition. Pursue a UN trusteeship. Delay the final status question indefinitely. Clifford made the counterargument. The Jewish people had earned a homeland through 2,000 years of persecution and 6 million deaths. The United States had a moral obligation that could not be reduced to a calculation about oil prices. Recognizing Israel was the right thing to do, and history would judge America by whether it did the right thing when it mattered. Marshall looked at Clifford across the table and said something that Clifford remembered for the rest of his life. He said that if Truman followed Clifford's advice, and if Marshall were able to vote in the upcoming election, he would vote against Truman. He said it quietly, without apparent emotion, the way Marshall said everything. But the room understood the weight of it. The most respected man in America was telling the president that this decision was wrong enough to cost him Marshall's personal vote. Truman listened to both men. He thanked them. He ended the meeting without announcing a decision. 2 days later, he recognized Israel in 11 minutes. Now the question was not whether to recognize Israel. The question was whether recognition meant anything at all if the state being recognized was being overrun. And that question led immediately to the weapons problem, a problem that was about to force Truman into the most creative and carefully calibrated decision-making of his presidency. Israel needed arms. It needed them immediately. Not in 6 months, not after the State Department had fully processed the implications for American relations with the Arab world. Now, this week, today. But the formal American position had not changed. The arms embargo on the Middle East remained officially in place. Truman had not lifted it. He could not lift it, not without triggering an open institutional battle with Marshall and the Pentagon that would have consumed his administration at a moment when he had no political capital to spare. The 1948 election was months away. Truman was behind in every poll. The conventional wisdom in Washington was that he was going to lose. He could not afford a public rupture with George Marshall. So Truman did something else, something that does not show up cleanly in the official record. He worked the space between official policy and practical reality with the particular skill of a man who had grown up in the machine politics of Missouri and understood that what you could not do directly, you could sometimes accomplish indirectly. He did not lift the embargo. But he also did not pursue enforcement of the embargo with the vigor that his State Department wanted. When American Jewish organizations raised money and purchased surplus military equipment through European intermediaries, the investigations that might have shut those operations down moved slowly. When former American military pilots volunteered to fly for Israel, the prosecutions theoretically available to the Justice Department were not pursued with urgency. And then there was Adolf Schwimmer. Schwimmer was a former TWA flight engineer who had served in the Army Air Corps during the Second World War. He was a Jewish American who had decided with complete clarity and full awareness of the legal consequences that the survival of Israel was worth risking his own freedom. In the months surrounding Israeli independence, he organized a network that acquired surplus American military aircraft and flew them to Israel through a series of intermediary stops designed to obscure the origin and destination of the flights. The aircraft Schwimmer and his network acquired included real fighter planes. Czechoslovakia provided some surplus Messerschmitt 109s of all things. The same aircraft that had flown for the Luftwaffe during the Second World War, now being flown by Jewish pilots against Arab armies. The irony was not lost on anyone involved. Schwimmer was investigated. He was eventually convicted of violating the Neutrality Act. He was fined. He did not go to prison. Bill Clinton pardoned him in 2001. But in 1948, what mattered was that the aircraft got through, and that the men who calibrated the enforcement of the laws he was breaking were operating in an administration whose president had made clear, without ever saying it directly, exactly where his sympathies lay. The first truce came on June 11, 1948, 4 weeks after the Arab invasion began. It was supposed to be a pause in the fighting. For Israel, it became something far more important than that. During those 4 weeks, the weapons that had been flowing through back channels Czech arms, surplus American equipment, the aircraft Schwimmer's network had been acquiring, poured into Israel at a rate the Arab states could not match. By the time the truce ended and fighting resumed in July, Israel had more weapons than it had started the war with. It had artillery. It had fighter aircraft that could actually engage Arab planes in combat. It had the material foundation for an entirely different kind of war. The army that had been fighting desperately on multiple fronts in May, holding on through improvisation and sheer determination, was now an army that could maneuver, that could concentrate force, that could go after strategic objectives rather than simply trying to survive. But here is the question that nobody inside the Arab coalition had fully answered yet. How had this happened? How had the balance shifted so completely so quickly? And what were they going to do about it? Because in Part 2, the war is about to change again, and not everyone on the Israeli side is ready for what comes next. The ceasefire is ending. The offensive is about to begin. And one decision made in a room in Washington is going to determine whether everything that came before was worth it, or whether it all falls apart at the moment of potential victory. In Part 1, we watched Harry Truman make an 11-minute decision that changed the map of the world. We watched 5 Arab armies cross 5 borders simultaneously. We watched a state less than 24 hours old absorb its first aerial bombardment. And we watched Truman find the back channels, the quiet enforcement gaps, the selective investigations, the flight engineer named Adolf Schwimmer who flew real fighter planes across the Atlantic while federal prosecutors looked the other way. By the time the first ceasefire arrived on June 11, 1948, Israel had used 4 weeks of relative quiet to rearm at a pace the Arab coalition had not anticipated. The military balance had shifted. The war had turned. But here is what we did not tell you. Shifting the balance was one thing. Holding it was something else entirely. Because the moment Israeli forces went on the offensive in July 1948, a new problem emerged, one that no amount of back-channel arms dealing could solve on its own. 43% of the weapons that had arrived during the ceasefire were in the hands of units that did not know how to use them effectively. Artillery crews had rifles. Rifle units had been handed artillery manuals in languages they could not read. And the man responsible for fixing this, the man Truman's people were quietly relying on to translate the rearmament into actual battlefield capability, was about to walk into the most hostile meeting of his life. His name was David Marcus. He was a Brooklyn-born lawyer who had graduated from West Point, served on Eisenhower's staff during the Normandy planning, helped draft the surrender terms for Germany and Japan, and then, in an act that his superiors in the United States Army considered somewhere between eccentric and legally questionable, volunteered to serve as a military advisor to the Israeli forces under the pseudonym Mickey Stone. Marcus was not a nobody. He was a man with real credentials, real connections, and a real understanding of how modern armies were supposed to be organized, which made it all the more painful when he walked into a room in Tel Aviv in late June 1948 and was told in no uncertain terms that his expertise was not welcome. The man across the table was a senior commander in the newly forming Israel Defense Forces, a veteran of the Haganah's underground operations, a man who had spent years fighting the British with improvised weapons and cell-based tactics. His name was irrelevant. His attitude was not. He leaned back in his chair and looked at Marcus the way men look at people they have already decided not to listen to. "You want to reorganize my supply chains," he said, "during an active war. I want your artillery to hit what it's aimed at," Marcus replied. "Right now, it's not. Our men held Jerusalem with what they had. Your men held Jerusalem by a margin of approximately 40 rounds of ammunition per position. You want to know what happens when the next offensive starts, and that margin is 20K. The silence in the room lasted long enough to be uncomfortable. Then the commander stood up, signaled the meeting was over, and Marcus was escorted out. He had been in Israel for 3 weeks. He had already been threatened with removal twice. And the offensive that everyone knew was coming, the July push, that would determine whether the ceasefire gains held or evaporated, was less than 10 days away. But Marcus had not come alone, and he had not come without doing his homework. He had spent his first weeks quietly identifying the one man inside the Israeli military structure who understood logistics the way Marcus understood logistics. A former British Army supply officer named Shlomo, who had defected to the Israeli cause and who had been fighting a losing internal battle to professionalize the IDF's supply chain for months. Shlomo was not famous. He was not powerful. He was the kind of man who existed in every military organization, buried 3 levels below the decision-makers, absolutely correct about everything, and completely ignored. Marcus found him in a supply depot outside Haifa, reorganizing ammunition crates at 2 in the morning because nobody else was doing it correctly. "You've been trying to get someone to listen to you," Marcus said. Shlomo looked up. "For 4 months. I have a meeting with the general staff in 48 hours. I need your numbers. Everything, what we have, what we need, what the gap is between those 2 things." Shlomo set down the crate he was holding. For a moment, he said nothing. Then, "If I give you those numbers and nothing changes, they'll know it was me." "If nothing changes," Marcus said, "the July offensive fails. And then, none of this matters." Shlomo gave him the numbers. What Marcus brought to the general staff 2 days later was not an argument. It was a demonstration. He had obtained, through Shlomo's meticulous record-keeping, precise data on every weapons delivery that had arrived during the ceasefire, cross-referenced against the units that had received them, mapped against the training hours logged by those units, and measured against the combat performance metrics from the May fighting. The picture was stark. Units that had received artillery during the ceasefire had logged an average of 11 hours of operational training with those weapons. The standard for effective field use was 60 hours minimum. They were operating at 18% readiness on their most powerful new equipment. The general staff looked at the numbers. Some of them looked away. One of them, a younger officer, a man who had commanded a unit in the Galilee fighting and who had watched his men struggle with weapons they barely understood, spoke up. "What do you need?" he asked Marcus. 72 hours. Every artillery crew in the central sector. Concentrated training program. We run it like an American field school, fast practical. No theory, only the mechanics of hitting a target. 72 hours before the offensive. Yes. That's insane. It's less insane than sending those crews into battle at 18%. The room voted. It was close. But the younger officer carried enough weight, and Marcus got his 72 hours. What followed was the most compressed military training operation in the history of the 1948 war. Marcus and Shlomo pulled every qualified instructor they could find, former British Army, former American Army, anyone who had actually operated artillery at a professional level and ran rotating shifts across 6 training sites simultaneously. Crews rotated through every 8 hours. Sleep was optional. Mistakes were corrected immediately in the field, with live rounds when possible, and with dry runs when ammunition had to be conserved. Marcus moved between the sites personally sleeping in a jeep, eating whatever was handed to him, stopping at each station long enough to assess and correct and push to the next. On the 3rd morning, they ran the evaluation. 12 artillery crews, standard targets at field-relevant distances. The metric was simple rounds on target within a defined time window. Before the training, the average was 4 rounds on target out of 12 attempted. After 72 hours, it was 9, from 33% accuracy to 75% accuracy in 3 days. The younger officer who had cast the deciding vote stood at the edge of the evaluation range and watched the final crews run their sequences. He did not say anything for a long time. Then he turned to Marcus. Do the northern sector next. The July offensive began on July 9, 1948. Israeli forces moved against Lydda and Ramleh, 2 Arab towns that controlled the critical approaches to Jerusalem. They moved with artillery that could actually hit what it was aimed at. They moved with supply lines that Shlomo had reorganized during the same 72 hours, rerouting ammunition chains to eliminate the 3-day delivery lag that had been crippling frontline units. They moved with a command structure that Marcus had spent 3 weeks quietly upgrading from the inside, 1 conversation at a time, 1 data presentation at a time, 1 72-hour miracle at a time. The Arab Legion, which had been so methodical and professional in its siege of Jerusalem, found itself responding to an enemy that was no longer reacting. Israel was initiating. The Legion's commanders sent back reports to Amman describing something they had not anticipated: coordinated multi-axis pressure that exploited gaps faster than the Legion could close them. Lydda fell. Ramleh fell. The road to Jerusalem opened. The siege that had been strangling the city for weeks was broken in 72 hours of sustained offensive pressure. The Arab coalition's reaction was a combination of shock and desperate reassessment. Egypt called for a second truce. Transjordan's commanders, who had been so confident in May, were now looking at maps that told a different story than the one they had planned around. The military balance that they had expected to be permanent: 5 regular armies against 1 improvised defense force had been replaced by something they did not have a framework for understanding. What they did not know, and what Truman's people in Washington were only beginning to piece together from their own intelligence reports, was that the transformation was not over. Marcus had proven that 72 hours of concentrated effort could move a unit from 18% readiness to 75%. Multiply that across an entire army. Multiply that across the weeks of the second truce that was now being negotiated. Multiply that against an Arab coalition that was exhausted, that had overextended its supply lines, that had lost the initiative it had spent years planning to hold permanently. The second truce came into effect on July 18, 1948. 9 days of offensive operations had changed the geography of the war more fundamentally than 5 weeks of the Arab invasion had changed it in the other direction. But in Washington, Harry Truman was reading a different report. Not about the battlefield. About the man who had made the battlefield possible. David Marcus Mickey Stone, the Brooklyn lawyer who had reorganized an army in 72 hours and broken the siege of Jerusalem, had been shot and killed by an Israeli sentry on June 11th, the first day of the first truce, mistaken for an intruder in the dark outside his headquarters. He never saw the offensive he had made possible. He never saw Lydda fall or the road to Jerusalem open. He was the first American general to die in combat since the Second World War. His death was classified. His role was officially unacknowledged. In Washington, his name appeared in no public statement, no press release, no official recognition of any kind, because officially he had never been there. Truman read the file. He set it down. He did not comment on it publicly. He could not. The entire architecture of deniable support that had made Israel's survival possible depended on that silence. But here is what Truman also read in that same report, buried in the final paragraph. Israeli military intelligence had intercepted communications suggesting that the Arab coalition had identified the source of Israel's rearmament. They knew about the Czech weapons. They suspected American involvement, and they were not sitting quietly with that knowledge. Because in the weeks ahead, the question was no longer whether Israel could survive. The question was whether the men who had made survival possible, the back-channel operators, the selective enforcers, the midnight trainers, could survive the exposure of what they had done. The second truce was holding, but somewhere in Cairo, somewhere in Amman, someone was building a file. And when Part 3 begins, that file is about to land on a desk that nobody expected, and it is going to force Truman into the most dangerous decision he had made yet. The war for Israel's survival was won on the battlefield. The war for its legitimacy was just beginning. In Parts 1 and 2, we watched Harry Truman recognize Israel in 11 minutes, watched 5 Arab armies cross 5 borders simultaneously, and watched a back-channel rearmament operation transform a desperate defensive war into something that looked for the first time like a war Israel could actually win. We watched David Marcus reorganize an artillery corps in 72 hours and break the siege of Jerusalem. We watched the July offensive push Arab forces back across lines they had crossed with absolute confidence in May. And at the end of Part 2, we told you that somewhere in Cairo, someone was building a file. That file is now complete. And the number at the top of it will tell you everything about how badly the Arab coalition had miscalculated. Between May 15th and July 18th, 1948, 64 days, Israeli forces had reversed a military situation that every professional assessment in the Western world had rated as unwinnable. The Arab coalition had entered the war expecting it to last weeks. They were now entering their 3rd month, and they were losing. The Egyptian General Staff convened an emergency session in Cairo on July 22, 1948, 4 days after the second truce took effect. The men in that room had spent years planning the destruction of a Jewish state before it could establish itself. They had artillery. They had aircraft. They had the weight of 5 nations behind them. And they had failed to achieve in 2 months what they had told their governments would take 2 weeks. The session lasted 6 hours. What emerged from it was not a new strategy. It was something more dangerous, a desperate one. Egyptian intelligence had pieced together with reasonable accuracy the outline of the back-channel rearmament. They knew about the Czech weapons. They had identified the flight routes Schwimmer's network had used. They had tracked the ammunition deliveries that had flowed into Israel during the first truce at a rate that no official embargo should have permitted. And they had drawn the obvious conclusion that the United States government, while maintaining a posture of official neutrality, had effectively chosen a side. The Egyptian foreign minister prepared a formal diplomatic protest. It was detailed, documented, and potentially explosive. If it reached the right desks in Washington and the wrong desks in the press, it had the capacity to blow open the entire architecture of deniable support that had kept Israel alive. The protest landed in Washington on July 29th. Truman read it. He set it down. He did not respond to it publicly for 11 days, and when he did, the response was measured, careful, and said almost nothing. But privately, the pressure was immediate and real. Marshall's people at the State Department circulated the Egyptian document internally with a cover memo that did not need to say what it was saying, that the back channels had been identified, that the deniability was eroding, and that the administration was now exposed in ways that its political opponents could exploit in an election year. Truman was already behind in every poll. The 1948 election was 3 months away. Thomas Dewey's campaign was operating on the assumption that the White House was essentially already theirs. The last thing Truman needed was a documented foreign policy scandal involving secret weapons transfers to a country in the middle of an active war. But here is what the Egyptian protest had not accounted for. The file they had built, accurate as it was about the rearmament, had been assembled too late. Because by July 29th, when that document reached Washington, the military situation on the ground had already moved beyond the point where diplomatic pressure could reverse it. Israel had not just survived the first weeks. It had used those weeks to build something that could not be dismantled by a strongly worded memo. The proof of that came 9 days later on August 8, 1948, in the Negev desert. And it came in a way that nobody in Cairo or Amman or Washington had fully anticipated. The Negev was the contested southern territory that the original UN partition plan had allocated to Israel, but that Egyptian forces had pushed into aggressively during the May invasion. By August, Egyptian forces held a series of fortified positions across the northern Negev that functionally cut Israeli territory in two, separating the northern population centers from the southern settlements, and threatening to make the entire southern allocation of the partition plan a dead letter. The positions were well supplied, dug in, and covered by Egyptian air power that had not been seriously challenged since the May fighting. What the Egyptians did not know was that during the two truces, Israeli air capability had transformed. The Messerschmitts that Schwimmer's network had delivered, and 4 additional Spitfires acquired through separate channels in Czechoslovakia, had been absorbed into a functioning air force with trained pilots, organized logistics, and a command structure that Marcus's organizational work had helped professionalize. It was small. It was not the RAF, but it was real, in a way that it had not been in May, when modified civilian aircraft dropping homemade bombs had constituted the entirety of Israeli air power. On August 8th, at 0430 hours, 6 Israeli aircraft crossed into the northern Negev at low altitude. They came in under Egyptian radar coverage, flying a route that Israeli intelligence had identified through 3 weeks of careful observation. Their targets were the supply lines feeding the Egyptian forward positions, specifically 2 road junctions and a fuel depot that the Egyptian Negev force depended on for resupply. The first strike lasted 4 minutes. Bombs fall. Fuel ignites. The depot goes up in a column of fire visible from 12 kilometers. The road junctions take direct hits on the access points, not the roads themselves, which can be repaired, but the bridges over the 2 dry riverbeds that make the roads usable for heavy vehicles. Both bridges collapse. The aircraft are gone before the Egyptian anti-aircraft crews have finished rotating their guns toward the sound. The second wave comes 40 minutes later. 3 aircraft. Different approach vector. By now, the Egyptian positions are alert guns searching the sky. But the second wave is not targeting the supply lines. It is targeting the communications infrastructure, the relay station, and the forward command post that the Egyptian Negev force uses to coordinate with Cairo. The relay station takes 2 direct hits. The command post takes 1. Communications between the Egyptian Negev force and its headquarters go dark for 6 hours. In those 6 hours, Israeli ground forces move. 2 infantry brigades reorganized and resupplied during the truce's advance on the Egyptian forward positions from the north and east simultaneously. They are moving faster than the May fighting would have suggested possible. They are coordinating in ways that would not have been possible before Marcus's organizational work. Artillery, the same artillery crews that had gone from 33% accuracy to 75% in 72 hours, opens on the Egyptian positions with a precision that the Egyptian commanders, when they reconstruct the battle later, will describe in their reports as unlike anything they had faced in the May fighting. The Egyptian forward positions hold for 4 hours. They are professional soldiers. They are not cowards. But they are fighting without air support because Israeli aircraft are now actively contesting the airspace in ways Egyptian pilots had not prepared for, and without reliable resupply, because the depot is still burning and the bridges are down, and without clear communications with their headquarters. At 1100 hours, the two northernmost Egyptian positions begin to pull back. Not collapse. Not rout. Professional withdrawal under pressure. But withdrawal. By 1400 hours, Israeli forces have advanced 8 kilometers into territory that Egyptian forces had held since May. They have taken 3 fortified positions. They have captured supplies intended for the Egyptian advance, including ammunition fuel and a cache of artillery shells that will be redistributed to Israeli units within 48 hours. Egyptian casualties in the engagement 231 confirmed with additional wounded. Israeli casualties 64. The ratio tells the story more clearly than any strategic analysis. An Egyptian artillery officer who survived the engagement and was captured wrote in his field notes that Israeli intelligence translated and that eventually found their way into the historical record, a single sentence that captured what his side had experienced. He wrote that fighting the Israelis in August was not the same war as fighting them in May. He did not elaborate. He did not need to. The news of the August 8th engagement reached Washington on August 9th. It reached Truman's desk alongside the ongoing diplomatic pressure from the Egyptian protest document. Truman read both. He understood what they meant together. The Egyptians were telling him through diplomatic channels that they knew what America had done, and the battlefield report was telling him that what America had done had worked. He still did not respond publicly to the Egyptian protest. The silence was its own message. Across the Arab coalition, the effect of the Negev engagement was immediate and cascading. Transjordan's military command, which had been the most professional and most confident of the coalition partners, revised its assessment of the military situation for the first time since the war began. The revision went upward through the command structure to King Abdullah, who had been receiving optimistic reports for 2 months. The revised assessment was not optimistic. It described an Israeli military force that had in the space of 60 days transformed from a collection of poorly equipped defenders into a coherent offensive army, capable of combined arms operations, coordinated air artillery, and infantry that the coalition had not anticipated and was not currently prepared to counter. Abdullah had already been in quiet contact with Israeli representatives through British intermediaries. Those contacts now became more serious. The king, who had entered the war expecting to expand Transjordan's territory, had begun calculating what a negotiated exit might look like. He was not ready to say so publicly, but the calculation had started. In the south, Egypt pressed for a renewal of UN ceasefire arrangements with an urgency that it had not shown in June. The momentum had reversed completely. The coalition that had launched a war of extermination, Azam Pasha's word, not anyone else's, was now maneuvering for the most favorable exit it could negotiate. Israeli forces consolidated the Negev gains through August and into September. UN mediator Volker Bernadotte continued to press for a settlement, but the terms he was proposing, terms that would have significantly reduced Israeli territory compared to the partition plan, were losing political traction with every week that the military situation moved further in Israel's favor. The diplomatic framework that Truman had maintained, insisting that any settlement must not reward the Arab states for launching an invasion, was holding. The combination of battlefield reality and diplomatic position was narrowing the options available to the Arab coalition in ways that no single-element arms training air power diplomacy could have accomplished alone. By September 1948, the shape of the final outcome was visible to anyone willing to look at the maps honestly. Israel had not just survived, it had won. Not the formal armistice agreements, those would come in early 1949, but the military and political reality that those agreements would formalize had been established in the 6 months between May and September in the back channels and the training depots and the 72-hour miracles and the dawn strikes over the Negev. The war that everyone had predicted Israel would lose had been won by men whose names appeared in no official American documents. By a flight engineer who went to federal court and walked out with a fine. By a Brooklyn lawyer who died in the dark outside his headquarters, mistaken for an intruder 2 weeks before he could see the results of his work. By a supply officer named Shlomo, who reorganized ammunition crates at 2 in the morning because nobody else was doing it correctly. And by a president from Missouri who found ways to help that were not officially help. Who held diplomatic lines that nobody could publicly acknowledge he was holding, and who understood that the distance between what the policy said and what the enforcement of the policy allowed was exactly large enough if measured precisely to save a country. But here is what the history books almost never tell you. What happened to the men who made this possible after the war ended? What happened to the networks, the back channels, the quiet understandings? What did Truman say privately about what he had done, and what did it cost him? Because the final chapter of this story is not about battles or borders or armistice agreements. It is about what happens to the people who do necessary things in impossible circumstances when the necessity is over and the circumstances have changed, and the world moves on to the next crisis. That chapter, the one that almost nobody knows, is where we are going in part 4. 4 parts, 4 hours of history. We began with Egyptian bombs falling on Tel Aviv at dawn on May 15, 1948. A state less than 18 hours old, absorbing its first aerial bombardment. We watched Harry Truman recognize Israel in 11 minutes, while his own Secretary of State threatened to vote against him. We watched Adolf Schwimmer fly fighter planes across the Atlantic, while federal prosecutors looked the other way. We watched David Marcus reorganize an artillery corps in 72 hours and break the siege of Jerusalem. We watched the August 8th strikes over the Negev turn a desperate defense into a decisive offense. And at the end of part 3, we asked the question that history almost never answers. What happened to the men who made this possible after the guns went silent? The answer is more complicated, more human, and more instructive than anything that happened on the battlefield. David Marcus never came home. We told you that in part 2, but the full weight of it deserves a moment of stillness here at the end. He died on June 11, 1948, the first day of the first truce, wrapped in a bedsheet, because he could not sleep in the heat shot by an Israeli sentry who heard movement in the dark and did not wait to ask questions. He was 46 years old. He had been in Israel for less than 4 months. He never saw the offensive he made possible. He never saw Lydda fall, or the road to Jerusalem open, or the Negev engagement on August 8th, where artillery crews he had trained in 72 hours performed at a level that Egyptian commanders described as a different war than the one they had fought in May. His body was flown home to the United States. The Army listed his death as having occurred while on leave. His role in Israel was classified. His widow Emma was told very little about what he had actually been doing in the weeks before he died. For years, the man who had arguably done more than any single military figure to professionalize the Israeli army in its founding weeks existed in the official record as a footnote, a West Point graduate who died under ambiguous circumstances in a foreign country during a war that America was officially not involved in. Israel did not forget him. He was designated a general in the Israel Defense Forces, posthumously the only person ever to hold that rank who was not an Israeli citizen. A town in the Judean hills was named Mishmar David in his memory. Decades later, Kirk Douglas played him in a film called Cast a Giant Shadow, which was the first time most Americans heard his name. Emma Marcus lived long enough to see that film. She sat in the theater and watched an actor portray the man she had said goodbye to in the spring of 1948, and she said afterward that the film captured something true about who he was, even where it got the specific facts wrong. That is probably the most any historical film can claim. Adolf Schwimmer was convicted. He was fined $10,000 for violating the Neutrality Act. He did not go to prison. He built a career in the Israeli aviation industry, eventually becoming a founder of Israel Aerospace Industries, one of the most sophisticated defense manufacturing operations in the world, a company that today employs 16,000 people and produces systems used by air forces across 4 continents. The flight engineer who risked federal prison to fly second-hand fighter planes through back channels in 1948 spent the next 5 decades building the industrial infrastructure that made Israeli air power self-sustaining. Bill Clinton pardoned him in 2001, 53 years after the conviction. Schwimmer was 84 years old. He accepted the pardon without a great deal of public ceremony. He had been busy. The supply officer named Shlomo, the man who gave Marcus the numbers that changed the argument in the general staff meeting, who reorganized ammunition chains at 2 in the morning because nobody else was doing it correctly, never achieved public recognition of any kind. He continued working in Israeli military logistics for years after the war, the kind of man who makes systems function without anyone noticing until the systems stop functioning. History does not record what happened to him after he left military service. This is not a failure of the historical record. It is an accurate reflection of how indispensable people are treated when the emergency is over and the indispensability is no longer visible. Harry Truman won the 1948 election. Every poll had him losing. Every newspaper had him losing. The famous photograph of him holding up the Chicago Tribune front page that read, "Dewey defeats Truman," has become one of the defining images of American political history, the physical artifact of how completely the conventional wisdom had failed. He served a full second term. He left office in January 1953 with approval ratings that had collapsed under the weight of the Korean War and the political pressures of his final years. History's reassessment of him took decades. Today, he consistently ranks among the upper tier of American presidents in surveys of historians, and the recognition of Israel is cited in almost every serious evaluation of his presidency as one of the defining moral decisions of his time in office. George Marshall was wrong about the military outcome and right about the diplomatic consequences. American relations with the Arab world were complicated by the 1948 war in ways that shaped Middle Eastern politics for the rest of the 20th century and into the 21st. Both things are true simultaneously, and anyone who tells you that Truman's decision was simply right or simply wrong is not engaging honestly with the full weight of what happened afterward. The correct answer is that it was right and complicated, which is the honest answer for most decisions that actually matter. The back-channel rearmament operation that Schwimmer and others had run in 1948 became a template not officially, not in any documented policy sense, but practically for how states support allies in situations where official support is politically impossible. The specific mechanisms evolved. The principle did not. You can trace a direct line from the selective enforcement of the 1948 embargo to the way arms and intelligence have moved through deniable channels in every major conflict since. The men who built those channels in 1948 were improvising under pressure. What they improvised became doctrine. The broader lesson, the one that Marcus's 72-hour artillery training program demonstrated with particular clarity, is that the gap between what an organization is capable of and what it is currently achieving is almost always larger than the organization's leadership believes. Marcus looked at Israeli artillery crews operating at 18% readiness and saw not a failure, but an opportunity. 72 hours of concentrated practical waste, nothing training, moved them to 75%. The equipment had not changed. The men had not changed. What changed was the quality and intensity of the preparation. Every military organization since 1948 that has taken that lesson seriously has performed better than organizations that have not. Most do not take it seriously until a crisis forces them to. The institutional resistance that Marcus faced the senior commander, who told him that reorganizing supply chains during an active war was insane, is not specific to the Israeli military in 1948. It is a feature of every large organization that has existed long enough to develop established procedures and the people who are invested in those procedures. The resistance to Marcus was not stupidity. It was the entirely rational self-protection of a system that had survived by doing things a particular way and was being asked to change those things under maximum pressure. Understanding that resistance is not weakness makes it easier to overcome. Marcus overcame it not by arguing against the system, but by bringing data that the system's own logic could not dismiss. 9 rounds on target out of 12 compared to 4 out of 12 before. Numbers that the institutional resistance had no answer for. Now for the detail that almost nobody knows. The one that reframes everything. In 2013, the Israeli State Archives released a collection of documents from the 1948 war that had been classified for 65 years. Among them was a handwritten note dated June 10, 1948, one day before Marcus died, in Marcus's own handwriting, addressed to no one in particular, apparently written in the early hours of the morning when he could not sleep. It was not a military document. It was not a report or an assessment or a recommendation. It was a list. Specifically, it was a list of the things he wanted to do when he got home. See Emma. Eat a real meal at a specific restaurant in Brooklyn whose name he wrote down. Walk across the Brooklyn Bridge, which he said he had been thinking about for weeks. Read a novel. Sleep past 6 in the morning. 11 items. The handwriting was clear and unhurried. The handwriting of a man who had been planning and executing under pressure for months, and was allowing himself just briefly to imagine what normal felt like. The note was found among his effects after his death. Emma received it along with his other personal belongings. Whether she read it and what she thought when she did the historical record does not say. What the record does say is this. From a Brooklyn lawyer with a West Point degree and a bedsheet he could not sleep without, from a flight engineer with a federal conviction and a passion for aviation, from a supply officer reorganizing ammunition crates at 2 in the morning, from a president from Missouri who understood that what you could not do directly, you could sometimes accomplish indirectly. From all of these ordinary people doing extraordinary things in impossible circumstances, came a state. A real state with borders, and an army, and eventually a Supreme Court, and universities, and a film industry, and 16,000 people building aerospace systems, and all the ordinary complexity of a country that exists and intends to keep existing. The final number is this: in the 64 days between May 15th and July 18th, 1948. Israel reversed a military verdict that every professional assessment in the Western world had rated as final. Not with superior numbers, not with superior equipment at the start. With preparation, with improvisation, with the selective application of American support that never appeared in any official document, and with the particular stubbornness of people who had decided that the outcome the experts had predicted was not the outcome they were willing to accept. Harry Truman made it possible. Not alone. Not directly. Not in ways that show up cleanly in the record. But he made it possible. And a man from Brooklyn who wanted to walk across a bridge and sleep past 6 in the morning made it real. If you know a story like this one, a story about ordinary people who did something that the official record either buried or forgot, tell us in the comments. History is full of men and women like Marcus and Schwimmer and Shlomo, people whose names are not in the textbooks, but without whom the textbook version of events would not have happened. Subscribe, and we will keep finding them. Because the most important decisions in history are almost never made by the people history remembers. They are made in supply depots at 2 in the morning, and in 72-hour training programs in the desert, and in 11 minutes in the White House, by people who understood that the distance between what was possible and what was permitted was exactly large enough, if measured precisely and crossed carefully, to change the world.